From the Cold War to propaganda and the deep state, Pelle NEROTH Taylor on today's News Talk, TNT.
Welcome back to the Pelle NEROTH Taylor Show on this Thursday, 19th of September, 2024. Well, we've got Paul Gottfried with us in a minute. He's writes fabulous essays on in a magazine he edits called Chronicles, and he's written about abortion, but he's written about endless other topics. And his book from 2002, The Strange Death of Liberal Marxism, was an absolute key text for me in understanding the way that the ruling classes of Europe pivoted away from conservatism and family values, and if they were social democrats, from kind of modest redistributionist policies, becoming these extremists, cultural Marxists, basically, looking at the world through the thin slit of an armored car, seeing what they wanted to see, completely ideological and pushing for ultra-liberal progressive values, neoliberalism, militarism, and crazy ideas like transgenderism eventually that practically no one normal believes. And then calling these people who believe normal things, as it were, the far rightists. I mean, and Paul Gottfried traced this back to Marxism's failure as an economic system, and that was a lot of libertarians, a lot of clever economists like Friedrich Hayek talked about that in the 1950s and 60s. If you have centralized control of the economy, centralized control because you wanted to redistribute, then you don't have the price information of a free market, and it simply doesn't work because one central node can't determine people's private preferences or interactions. So it ends up with you running the whole show, which completely destroys people's autonomy and ability to make their own way in the world. That failed completely. Soviet Union was the graveyard of that. So the Marxists then found something else. They pounced on culture, and instead of the factories, they pounced on the universities and trained people. But they were just as interested in power as any Marxist ever was. But they used the children rather than the factory workers, the students. But they were like the old Marxists who saw economic power to seizing control through economic power, through the factory yard, as it were. These new Marxists saw the education sector and politics, but they were totally interested in power. And that's why where we are now with the kind of progressive elite. And that's been a kind of theme with a lot of the guests I've had on that we're now going to be ruled by communists if Kamala gets in and so on. So Paul Gottfried, when he wrote about that book, I thought there was a total revelation when I read that, because cultural Marxism wasn't as well known 20 years. I mean, it's got different names: cultural Marxism, communism, progressivism, whatever, the deep state, or the people talk about the bureaucracy of the permanent state and so on. Although the deep state also includes intelligence elements, so we mustn't get too much into it. But Paul and I were going to talk about abortion, I think. So we're going to get away from that philosophical stuff. And then we've got H Buckley, who in the next 20 minutes, who's going to talk about, well, actually, he's going to offer a defense of liberalism, saying that, it's been unfairly maligned. And he's just written a book about that. So we'll hear him out on that. Just a quick thing. I was approached by a guy, shall remain nameless, this morning, wanted me to conduct an interview with him on his podcast. And I thought there was something about him. He came out, the request came out of the blue, and I'd seen his name on Twitter. He's actually quite well known on Twitter, and his podcast is followed. He has his adherents. I'd heard of him, but something about that made me recoil. And I think I'm slightly afraid of the foreign Foreign Registrations Act, where the Russian media being cracked down on all over the place, or anyone who has any kind of affiliation and takes money from any kind of Russian source can then be held up. And that's the danger of that, is, of course, that you submit to traps, basically enticements so it might turn out this guy, he shall remain nameless, might not have turned up to be so innocent after all. He was offering me something and I said no, but if I'd said yes, I could have been tagged as a kind of national security risk or something. Anyway, he wanted me to talk about actually quite a decent and interesting subject, which has kind of fallen beneath the radar in our fevered political discussion, the election, but it's how Kamala Harris fought to keep non-violent prisoners locked up. And I say that because Kamala Harris is usually attacked from the right as being this kind of liberal, softy, whatever, a person who can't take on the powers that be. and is lets out killers and so on, and turned California into sort of a robber's paradise when she was Attorney General. But this guy actually, he pointed an article in Prospect, by the way, it's a very famous American political magazine, but it said this topic has fallen off the radar. And this was actually Kamala Harris turned down requests from far up in the American legal hierarchy, even the Supreme Court, for requiring the state of California to reduce its prison population. Federal courts seldom look to prisoner release as a remedy of last resort, but California was a unique case during Kamala's rule there. With its uniquely awful prison system at its height, it was stuffed to some 200% of its design capacity. There were not enough beds or medical personnel, but an extreme excess of bodies. In one prison, 54 prisoners shared a single toilet. Preventable deaths due to substandard and overstretched medical care occurred every 5 to 6 days. Suicidal inmates were locked up in telephone booth-sized cages for 24 hours at a time. And this is Prospect Magazine, an American magazine, by the way. For nearly 2 decades, Republican and Democratic administrations essentially ignored the problem. Despite constitutional protections for prisoners against cruel and unusual punishment, finally, in 2009, a federal district court found that no other plausible solution existed for getting the state to conform to a constitutionally reasonable standard than forced prisoner release. However, this was then rejected by Kamala Harris, who's then the Attorney General. The state appealed the district court ruling, and the Supreme Court then took up the case and found that California's prison system was in violation of the prisoners' Eighth Amendment rights. At that point, Kamala Harris had been the state's attorney general for just after 4 months, representing California as its top legal officer, but the Supreme Court ruling would have had to be enacted on her watch. According to the Supreme Court ruling, every 6 months, the state would have had to show to decrease its prison population in compliance with a threshold overseen by 3 judges. So it had to be basically reduce its massive overcapacity under Supreme Court ruling to be enacted by a local court, and California simply had to obey. However, Kamala Harris did nothing but stall and kept the prisoners in prison. So that goes against this idea that she's a kind of, liberal flakehead, but rather authoritarian person. And what this guy who shall remain nameless wanted me to do on his podcast was actually big this up and talk about it as a kind of harbinger of the kind of USA that Kamala Harris would lead, a profoundly authoritarian country in the sense of locking people up. And of course, she and Tim Walz have said worrying things about free speech. So the question will be, if people infringe on the liberals, leftists, progressives, cultural Marxists' conception of free speech, then will they be locked up? And is jail the first place to go for them? It might not be a sort of cavalcade of releases, but quite the opposite. So by April 2013, after Kamala just non-compliance with the federal rulings, just 2 months for the initial deadline given in the Supreme Court decision, California still had 10,000 prisoners more than the court-imposed ceiling. But Kamala Harris's office claimed that on behalf of California state that the Supreme Court had even no jurisdiction in the matter. And when asked by what date the state could identify their list of prisoners who are unlikely to reoffend, the defendants defiantly refused and stated, somewhat astonishingly, the last suggestion that we might order defendants to develop a system to identify low-risk prisoners vastly exceeds the scope of any court's prior orders. So basically, here we have the liberals talking about, the Supreme Court saying, let these people go because your California prison system is imprisoning them, up to phone booth-sized boxes, and then a lot of them are non-violent offenders. And why don't you think up a program to sort of define the ones that could be released without risk of reoffending? And Kamala Harris was kind of saying, pretending not to hear, basically. And even a liberal magazine like The Atlantic was unsparing of Harris's behavior, writing that her court filings are largely void of dispositive facts and unworthy of a first-year associate, much less the chief lawyer of our nation's most populous state. And according to writer Andrew Cohen, Harris's behavior may even have put her in breach of California's legal and ethical standards, which forbid filing a motion for an improper purpose. So, meanwhile, well, we can think of a sort of kind of slogan, Kamala prison or something, Kamala incarceration. I mean, what would Trump call her? Although I think Trump's quite in favor of law and order, mind you. But a lot of progressive, soft liberal supporters might be surprised at this picture of Kamala that hasn't really made it into the Hopi, joy, flaky, laughy, rainbow picture that she wants to paint. Anyway, but lawyers from her office in 2014 claimed that non-violent offenders needed to stay incarcerated lest they lose bodies for fire camps in the wildfire-plagued state. She was quick to disavow that memo, claiming she had no knowledge, but it squares firmly with the sort of arguments her office was putting forward for multiple years preceding it. Harris, meanwhile, was known to run an extremely centralized attorney general's office with few things coming in or going out with her express sign-off. So, I mean, she was saying basically that these non-violent offenders were needed by the prison system to carry out little sort of non-paid labor for the state of California, like fire watches, and I don't know. I don't suppose they have chain gangs anymore. But anyway, and then when the Daily Beast reported it, Kamala said, "Oh, I have nothing to do with that," you know. But it turns out she was a control freak in her office, and so she probably did know. Even so, she was probably lying. She could well have been lying through her teeth. The point is, actually, incidentally, by the way, one thing that not nearly enough of people have raised, I think, in all this Hopi changey vibe, is how the very low retention rate she had of her staff. I mean, so she was a control freak over prisons and a control freak over her staff, so much that she had an extremely high turnover rate, I think 90% or more. And it's your inferiors, as it were, your staff, your employees. That's how you get the measure of a person's character. I've said so many times. If you go on to the various blog sites devoted to Donald Trump, there are long accounts of how Trump is loved by his staff. I mean, there's a core of threads all devoted to this. And I guess it could be Don Jr.'s hiring graduates to pen fictive employees reports, but okay. But I guess they have a genuine air about them. So Trump was loved by his staff. Kamala Harris, the ones who knew and the ones who were tipped by him, Kamala Harris had very testy relations with them. So she was a contested, controversial attorney general who seemed to defy the Supreme Court and seemed to be very happy to lock people up. Anyway, we've got so just to continue this article, as people draw my attention to, Harris has been criticized on multiple occasions for fighting to keep people, including innocent ones, in prison. In the case of Daniel Larson, an ex-felon sentenced to 27 years to life under California's three strikes law, Harris argued that even if Danny was innocent, his conviction should not be reversed because he waited too long to file his petition. And while her trenchant opposition to decarceration of the state's prisons does align with those stories, her role in attempting to subvert the authority of the country's highest legal body, that is the Supreme Court, for the sole purpose of preventing the release of low-risk prisoners, has gone largely unchallenged. Has it not? Yes. So sometimes these little articles can cast a new light on a presidential candidate, and maybe the Trump campaign will pick it up. That said, I guess he's a law and order guy. So anyway, what kind of people will be locked up? Will it be a communist United States? Well, we've got Hillary Clinton, that senile old bint, talking on her favorite channel, MSNBC, saying, free speech is not a given. I think Kamala Harris has been saying the same thing. Misinformation should be an imprisonable offense, disinformation. Of course, this was spoken to the MSNBC, that woman, God, I can't remember her name. She was, all over the Russiagate hoax, as of course it was initiated by Hillary Clinton. So those two, if anyone's going to be guilty of misinformation, it's Mrs. Clinton and her favorite journalist on MSNBC. But Rachel Maddow's her name. But I didn't see any self-awareness of that. So if misinformation is an imprisonable offense, It wouldn't be necessarily all those far righters who can fill the prisons of Kamala Harris's America. It will be a disinformation artist like Hillary Clinton herself. But I'm not expecting any self-awareness or self-realization on that part. Anyway, we're going to go into a very quick break. And this is the Pelle NEROTH Taylor Show on TNT News Talk, back after the break.
It sounds pretty good. It sounds real, dude. Not bad, huh?
Free speech is alive and well on today's News Talk, TNT.
Welcome to the Pelle NEROTH Taylor Show on this Thursday afternoon. Well, I remember about 20 years ago, when neoconservatism was all the rage, and it was called for a muscular foreign policy and a global one world community, and I never felt at home with that. And then I remember reading Paul Gottfried's writings. He's sometimes known as the father of Paleoconservatism, which supports restrictions in immigration, decentralization, trade tariffs and protectionism, economic nationalism, isolationism, that is no wars, and a return to traditional conservative ideals relating to gender, race, sexuality, culture, or society. Actually, I thought that was just what conservatism was, but of course, conservatism had been hijacked and splintered into different movements. So paleo, which I guess means old or something, suited the label I felt with very well. And then he wrote a fantastic book called The Strange Death of Liberal Marxism, which I used as a textbook basically for understanding the pivot of the European ruling class into basically crazy ideas. And now Paul Gottfried is still active. He's a historian and he edits a fantastic magazine. You can find it on the web called Chronicles. And I think we're going to talk a little bit about the US election campaign and his latest bevy of articles in that magazine. Welcome to the show, Paul. Welcome back, my friend, because you've been on before.
Well, thank you very much for having me on again.
You wrote one of your colleagues, one of your staff wrote a fantastic article about Orban, and how very few people have mentioned his two really, really long speech that he gave in Romania, that your writer says that is one of the great European speeches of the century. Of course, he is hated by the bien-pensant of Brussels, which you've skewered in your earlier writings. Tell us a little bit about that article.
Yeah, the one who should actually be defending this is our Serbian foreign policy editor, Sergej Trifkovic. And I find it remarkable. I told him that a Serb should have so much sympathy for an Hungarian since the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Serbs clash in World War I. Right. But he is properly an admirer of Orban, and he sees in Orban somebody who believes in democratic nations and who's defending the concept in opposition to the woke totalitarian monolith that has taken over Western Europe and much of North America by now, including the United States. And the speech that Orban gave in Romania, I think, may also be important for the fact that he is speaking in a country that has traditionally been the enemy of Hungary, Romania, which took considerable land from Hungary after World War I. And there is a large Hungarian minority there, which I think has understandable grievances. But he went there to give a speech, and in which he defends the idea of nations. By the way, I too spoke in Romania, in Iași, at the university a number of years ago, and made a similar speech, in defense of nations, and that democracy and nationhood go together. They're inseparable. And the war against nationhood is a war against self-determination and against democratic liberties. So
That's right.
I think the national cause is very much bound up with the future of popular government in the West.
And we've moved away from that. I mean, what you wrote about, which was a revelation, has now become more accepted. And we've got a European, a global. A lot of this talk about globalism comes from your writings. I mean, I don't know if it was directly affected, but you were one of the first to write about it. Post-Cold War elites, their interest in strange lifestyle they were not centered in their local polity democratically. They met each other in Brussels or Washington or Geneva, and they all chummy with each other. And like, let's say I'm located in Sweden. Political parties don't need the population anymore for funding, or there's no accountability. They just go to Brussels and pass all the legislation via the Brussels machine, and then impose it on their own populations. And they don't come out of the roots of their people. They live in they know they have friends in Washington and Berlin and New Delhi. And this is the same in India. You have a ruling class there that speaks English, drinks wine, listens to Mozart, and doesn't have its roots in the Indian soil, as it were. I think Modi is probably an exception. Yeah. Would you say, and Trump, of course, in America, do you think, would you call yourself the father of Trumpism?
Would I call only in the sense that I ally myself with the populist right in Europe and the United States. I suppose I am a supporter of Trumpism as opposed to Trump. I think he's a very imperfect representative of what we believe. But insofar as he does stand for opposition to the elites, to the woke totalitarian elites that have taken over in the West, I do support him. In fact, I will admit to having sent several donations to his campaign, and I even have a Trump van sign in front of my house, much to the consternation, I should point out, of my neighbors who work at the college across the street where I had been a professor. When I noticed the Kamala signs going up, immediately we went out and we purchased 2 Trump signs, which are now being put up next to our house.
Are these elites, these transnational elites who call democracy far rightism? I mean, basically, if you just replace the word far right with the word popular or democratic, then you get a better interpretation. Are they Marxist? Is it this kind of novel Marxism that has taken over our elites?
Not at all. And this is a point on which one of many points which I'm fighting with the conservative movement in the United States. There's nothing Marxist about these people. They are, as I say, they're part of a post-Marxist left, which is largely funded by crony capitalists who do extremely well. The claim that Kamala Harris makes to represent the working class is nonsense, and most of the working class are on the other side. The left in the United States, the political left, is always saying we're pro-working class because we want everyone to be forced into unions. Of course, they want everyone to be forced into unions. Most workers don't want to be in unions. Most industrial workers, because they would simply become an adjunct of public sector unions, which give major donations to the Democratic Party, and that way they can milk the workers for more to support the ruling class. But in most respects, the working class is totally alienated from the so-called Marxist rulers, who are even less Marxist than the people who ran the Soviet Union. They're elitist. They rely to crony capitalism. They are obviously anti-democratic and totalitarian, but not in the same way as Marxists were. They are also culturally much more radical than the communists. The communists knew the difference between men and women. They weren't going to have gender change operations on children and so forth. So what we're dealing with, if you want to call it the left, is an entirely different ideology from Marxism. I think one of the reasons that American conservatives keep saying that these are Marxists is they're used to fighting the Soviet Union, right, or the Chinese Communist Party. So this is just one more example of them. But it is not Marxism. And it is much more dangerous for the Western world than Marxism ever was. And there was only minorities in the West that were Marxist, or the labor unions were in some cases in France and Italy, because the Communist Party leadership were able to make good deals for them. But in the United States, we have at least half the population voting for a woke leftist party, and who may win the next presidential race and may win the American Congress. And these people are a lot crazier than the Marxists, than American Marxists.
Yeah, I agree with you. And that's why, of course, RFK has gone over to Trump. That's why the American white working class votes for Trump, and in ditto in Europe, as you well know, all the so-called right-wing parties, the old working class used to vote for the Social Democrats. The Social Democrats all over Europe, they've changed. It's not the people who've changed. The Social Democrats have changed, and then they're going around calling their former voters white supremacists. How ridiculous is that? So these people, they're beautiful face, the lipstick on the pig, as it were, of crony capitalism. They call themselves leftists, but of course, how can they be leftist parties when Wall Street votes for them, funds them at a tune of 86-1 or something, and so it's basically they virtue signal and call themselves leftists, but they're allied with crony capitalism. It's a narcissistic elite out of touch with their people, and yet they still almost have 50% of the vote, which allows me to pivot onto the next topic, which was abortion. You wrote a fabulous little sarcastic piece on Kamala Harris's abortion policies and how young women are basically unpersuadable of the merits of Trump's position on that. What do you think about all this issue?
Yeah, what I argue in that piece to which you refer is that these people are not primarily concerned with abortion, because abortion rights in the United States are more extensive than they are among leftist parties in Europe. Yet they want more, and if they can get full term or abortion up to through the 9th month, then they'll insist on the right to be able to kill the baby coming through that birth canal. I mean, they seem to be insatiable in their demands, and what I'm suggesting is what's really driving this feminist impulse, which has now resulted in college-educated women being overwhelmingly on the cultural left, is dislike for men, war against the patriarchy, and abortion is simply an issue that they can grab onto right now. I noticed that even in a country like Germany, which in many ways is sort of a pace setter in politically correct totalitarianism, that the feminism is not as extreme as it is in the United States. I mean, they want quotas for women or something like that. They're not making war against gender or gender identity, or saying we can't identify women, but we can't identify women enough so that they should be given unlimited rights to dispose of their offspring or whatever they're asking for now. But the feminism in the United States seems to be particularly virulent, even by the standards of Western Europe.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I was surprised because I think in Europe, the abortion limits are like 20 weeks or something. And after 20 weeks, a fetus can survive. And my previous guest, who's an expert on this, she's from the Daily Signal, said, 4,000 women a year, 4,000 fetuses aborted a year that are survivable. I mean, this is like a 9/11 type figure. It's 4,000 bodies, fetuses. And I don't think a lot of young women know that. I mean, when you wittily talked in your article about how, they don't know anything about Kamala's policies, but she's our type. She has our democratic values or something. And you think, well, is that the values? Do you realize? I mean, I can understand abortion up to 6 weeks or 10 weeks. You regretted that sex and whatever, and that it's not. That's what most Americans approve of. But I mean, 25 weeks, that's too much. Do you think young women are aware of this, that they're so empathetic and caring and sharing that basically support, child murder, fetus murder?
Yeah. No, I don't think they're aware of it. I think they're angry at men because they've been told that men have exploited them for the last 10 million years. So they're angry at men. They want to get back at them, and therefore they insist on this unconditional right to murder their infants. And I think it'll just creep up. That give them they can have abortion through the last term, 3-month term, and then they'll want abortion or the right to dispose of their kids for the first or second, or it just goes on and on. And as I argue, you're not going to win over their votes. You're going to have to find some way to work around them. Until they get over their hysteria.
Right. So you don't believe that confronting them, Trump has stayed away. He doesn't confront it directly. My previous guest, I said, if you were to strategize his abortion approach, she said, confront them with the facts. This is child murder. But I think Trump is not going to take that advice. And you advise not as well.
Right. If you look at it, Kamala is winning by 19% on the abortion issue in terms of her, her standing against Trump. Although Trump wins on immigration and the economy, she wins overwhelming. And this erases any advantage. It is a non-issue. But what it means is, do you want to vote against the patriarchy? And all these, oh yes, we're going to vote against the patriarchy. And there is this enormous resource of anger into which the Democratic Party can tap anytime it wants. And I think women who do not go to universities are different. The ones who have terminal high school degrees in the United States tend to be conservative.
It's a huge topic, and I'm afraid we don't have time to, because this idea of young angry women, graduates, the ones they've never had it so good, young women, they 70% of journalists in Scandinavia are women, 70% of lawyers in Scandinavia are women, and they're full of rage. It's quite incredible. Anyway, Paul, thank you so much for catching up with you again, and check out your website at Chronicles, full of very, very thoughtful articles, and I can highly recommend them. Thank you so much, sir. And we've got to go on to our next guest on this Thursday afternoon. Thank you so much, Paul Gottfried there, and we're going to go over to our next guest shortly.
Swedish-British journalist, filmmaker, political writer, and author of 5 books, Pelle NEROTH Taylor, on today's News Talk, TNT.
Welcome back to the Pelle NEROTH Taylor Show on this Thursday afternoon. Well, with our last guest, Paul Gottfried, we're talking about Paleoconservatism, which is increasingly coming back into fashion in a somewhat twisted form of Trumpism. But his anti-war, so he's the protectionist, traditional conservative instincts appeal to a lot of people who also absorb a paleoconservatism as opposed to, let's say, neoconservatism, which was all the rage when he wrote that book 20 years ago. Well, what about liberalism? Well, we've got to talk about that. This maligned on this show, at least, a topic or subject or title. We've got H Buckley, who's written a book called The Roots of Liberalism, What Faithful Knights and the Little Match Girl Taught Us About Civil Virtue. And he brings in the fables of Hans Christian Andersen, who's a virtual neighbor of us here in Sweden. So we're looking forward to that. Welcome to the show, sir.
Yes, thank you very much. Please call me Frank.
Okay, Frank, you've tracing the roots of liberalism through the noblest traditions, virtues, and institutions and longings embedded in Western culture. What prompted you? Why does liberalism need a defense and protection in your eyes?
Well, first of all, since you just linked paleoconservatives to people in the Trump movement, I should note that I was a Trump speechwriter in 2016 and also this summer, so I know something about the campaign. And I think that liberalism characterizes what conservatives are all about today more than anything else. When you think about it, what conservatives are objecting to, for example, is limits on free speech, the cancel culture, or the left's racial categories. You know, we're on the side of Martin Luther King on that one. And so when you get down to it, we're the real liberals around here, not them. The left has given up on it. They don't want to even call themselves liberals anymore. So we've got this, very honorable and respectable tradition out there of American liberalism, or liberalism generally, and we should own it, right? We should, if they don't want it, right, it represents the best of America, and it really belongs to conservatives, since the left obviously doesn't want it anymore, right? It's rooted in our history. It's rooted in the thoughts of the framers as expressed by Lincoln, so that which is not liberal is not really American.
Yeah. Someone said that all Americans are liberals, basically. If you're American, you're a liberal. I mean, and in fact, conservatism, what is conservatism anyway? I mean, conservatism are the kind of blood and iron and the acceptance of violence, and it almost doesn't exist in Europe since the Second World War, does it? I mean, right. You when you hear a true conservative, you'll know it, because their language, their grammar, their moral grammar is so different from what we're deluged with, both from left and right. We're all basically quite milquetoast,
Well, I don't know. If we've inherited a British tradition in the United States or Australia or Canada or New Zealand, that was a liberal tradition, right? I mean, we were groomed in liberalism. We were groomed in democracy by the mother country. And even when we cast off the mother country, we retained the same kinds of institutions. We just wanted to make them more authentically liberal. But when conservatives talk, they also say things like, we respect tradition and we respect the family. The implication is the other guys don't. And that's just not true. They think they have property rights in the family. They don't, right? They think they have property rights in all sorts of decent, honorable impulses. They don't. Heroes of liberalism include people like Dwight Eisenhower. Nobody ever confused him with Hugh Hefner. So I wanted to look at where liberalism came from, right? And what I wanted to say was, look, it's not a philosophy, it's not a theory, it's not how we learned it, right? It wasn't, they might study Locke's second treatise in the universities, but that's not where we got it from, right? It's not even where the founders got it from. When you ask, what kind of books were the founders reading, they were reading the Bible, for heaven's sakes. So, or they were reading Plutarch, right? That's not where it came from. Where it came from is a Western tradition which incorporates a whole lot of things, which express themselves in ways you might not initially imagine. I mean, I talk about chivalry. So, a lot of people will have heard the story of the Black Prince at the Battle of Poitiers being chivalrous to a defeated enemy. But the story there is really about how do you treat prisoners of war, and the Code of Chivalry was a proto version of the Geneva Convention. So, that's where that came from, and we've not forgotten it. And chivalry also includes things which are, antediluvian in a way, but never forgotten, like the sexual differences in the Code of Chivalry and courtesy as expressed to women. So. You might think that we've gotten beyond that, but just try to ignore it, buddy, and you'll be told, "Hey, you're no gentleman," right? So, so we get it both ways, right? I mean, gender differences aren't supposed to exist, but just try to reduce them, and you'll get a lot real fast. As for the match girl, liberalism implies special duties to people left behind. Kindness was more or less invented in the 19th century by people like Dickens and Hans Christian Andersen. So, I'm a kid and I'm reading the story of a little match girl. I find it incredibly touching, and that affects how I feel about welfare programs generally. So, it is the case that we're liberals, we're not libertarians. We don't want to zero out the welfare state. And we don't want to make the state so small that we can drown it in the bathtub. That's other people. That's not us, right? I mean, we have a concern about wasteful spending and bad incentives and all of that. But bottom line, we think that the wealth created by a liberal culture, by free markets and the like, are things which permit us to treat welfare as a kind of luxury good, right? It's good we're wealthy because we can then ensure we're not going to leave people behind. That's all part of liberalism.
So, and could you just summarize the plot of Little Match Girl, if for those who haven't read their North European fairy tales?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I should have done that. The Little Match Girl is a story about a poor girl in the streets of Copenhagen who is utterly penniless, and all she's got is some matches, right? And she looks inside the window and she sees people dining. And it's so beautiful inside there, and she's so cold, so she lights up a match to warm herself a little bit and to look better into the window. And as the match goes out, she lights another one until all the matches have been burned, and she freezes. She freezes to death. So it's, if you read the story or similar stories, David Copperfield, you come away feeling this is wrong. We've got to do something about it. And it touches a basic sense of empathy, which is core to the idea of liberalism. The idea that we have a duty of benevolence. You're not going to get that from philosophy. You may get it. You'll get it from a variety of sources, from natural instincts, from religion, and so forth. But it's part of liberalism.
And but basically what you're saying is it's our Western civilization, it's our Western heritage or something. That is liberalism. Yeah, right.
Exactly. Yeah. Also, and you get it all over.
So we just define, is everyone then a liberal? Titles are so left and right, everything, we're so confused by what they mean, because they seem to have flipped around, as we were saying to Paul before, the working class are voting for Trump, the right, but they right. haven't changed, and so on and so on. So just taking away the title, if you gave it your book and you extirpated the word liberal from your text, Trump would read it, and then you handed it to Kamala Harris, would they both say, yes, I agree with this book, or would they differ from each other?
Well, Kamala Harris is simply on the side of joy, man. I mean, what else is there, right? So it's not as if we have any core ideas behind that one, with the exception of the ideas she expressed in 2019, which she's doing her best to forget about right now. As for Trump, I see Trump in the line of a Republican Party which cycles between liberals and libertarians, or liberals and pure free market types. And, in that sense, you have Lincoln, clearly a liberal, followed by Gilded Age right-wingers, Teddy Roosevelt, a progressive, Dwight Eisenhower, very much a progressive, and Trump. The point about Trump, to understand Trump, what you have to realize is this was a rejection of Goldwaterism. He took the Republican Party in a more leftward direction and discovered the sweet spot in American politics, which is socially conservative, but a little left of center on economics. And that's core liberalism.
Well, that's what I tell people. You realize he's like an old Scandinavian social democrat, and my Swedish left-wing friends say that's impossible, but they don't get it. That's why he attracted the old. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, but what you describe,
some of the rhetoric.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think intelligent people. I mean, I love his Sex Pistols type language, because he irritates people, and I laugh and I cheer that, because he's standing up for the little guy, and as I see it, and he knows that he preaches who are not as verbal and can't command the commanding heights of the media, and when he twits them, it irritates them. They love it. Why? I can't see why they don't get that if they're with their fancy degrees, Anyway,
well, his fans get it. The point is, fortitude is also a virtue.
Yeah,
and you've got this, not shown enough of that.
Exactly. I mean, every obstacle he overcomes, he is like living out herodom in the American. It's like a sort of fantastic story that we're all living through. I mean, Trump, one obstacle after the next, he overcomes it. Hopefully he'll overcome all of them, and Kamala's just sitting there and doing nothing, just uttering platitudes.
Yeah.
So, your book. I mean, is there a threat that it's a beautiful thing? You've basically described a book that describes the whole of Western civilization.
Again, it's called The Roots of Liberalism. It's available on Amazon, and as they say, cheap at half the price. But I take us into all sorts of stories, which I think one will immediately recognize as part of our heritage, and I show how this was really an expression of liberalism. So, the Paleos, for example, don't like individualism, but individualism, I'm an academic in America, so individualism in the sense of letting people do their own thing is precisely what conservatives are asking for these days, right? I mean, don't cancel me, let me exist in the margins as a conservative, tolerate me as an eccentric, right? And I'll be satisfied with that. That was basically the Academy of the 1950s, and it doesn't get better than that. Right. So that's part of it as well.
So, Frank, you're in academia and I'm not. Has the climate got worse in the last decade or so, intellectual climate?
Yeah, it has. I don't know if there's signs of revival. I'm teaching at something called Scalia Law School, which is about the only middle-of-the-road or right-of-center law school in America. So I'm insulated from a lot of it. But all the stories I hear and the students I've seen are trained in a woke cancel philosophy. So they've been educated to think that they know more than they do, and that they are given the right to cancel people, and that is really rather chilling. They're all little Pavlovs trying to, or little Pavlos trying to destroy their parents. And
wow.
And that's the big change, right? The smugness of it all. That's the thing which we didn't have. So I'm a baby boomer, so we had plenty of that when you get down to it.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah.
And
so
that,
even at your college, you get some whiff of that, even though it's much better than at some other places.
yeah, you get it from some of the students, the primness, the censoriousness, all of that. The absence of a measure of self-doubt and a sense of personal sin. So if you've been raised in certain religious traditions, you got the sense of guilt real good, but other people missed it.
So, I mean, everyone writes a book for a certain audience, I guess. Were you, in a way, writing a book for your students, saying, well, this is the inheritance that you have to deal with and respect somehow?
Nah, I teach law. I don't teach any of that stuff, but I'm having fun.
Okay. Right. Okay. So, the roots of liberalism, what Faithful Knights and the Little Match Girl, we just got about a minute left. Just tell us about what the Faithful Knight comes into it.
Well, the Faithful Knights, I mentioned the story of the Black Prince of Poitiers, and the idea is that the code of chivalry has to be incorporated. It's part of the military tradition. Colin Powell was asked, why didn't you take out Saddam Hussein in the first Iraq War? He said, because they were so defeated, it would have been unchivalrous. Right? This is, if you talk to soldiers, they know this. They know there are things they can't do. And there's never been a substitute for that in the battlefield. Never has been, never will be.
Your book sounds absolutely fascinating, and I think every student should probably have it in their Christmas stockings, and maybe they become a little bit censorious or stuck up, because we need to read more. The more we read, the 19th century was the century of the novel, and it taught us empathy, and that is the root of Western civilization, as you say. Frank Buckley, thank you, author of The Roots of Liberalism, What Faithful Knights and the Little Match Girl Taught Us About Civil Virtue. And that's it for our Thursday, and we'll have more guests and more analysis tomorrow on TNT News Talk on the Pelle and Taylor Show. See you tomorrow.